All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I'm Juliet Wade, and today we're going to talk about advertising. And you know, it's really actually kind of funny because my first thought when I think about advertising is always like real world advertising, because I don't see a lot of advertising in genre. Now, I was thinking about it, and I was realizing that in science fiction, sometimes you will get like these sort of future dystopias with lots of advertising. Um, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking of Blade Runner and Minority Report.
Well,
Yeah,
exactly. It's
Minority
the
Report.
future dystopia with advertising genre. So, Blade Runner is a really good example, and Minority Report, where they had the thing that would respond to your eyeballs. that was a good one too. Did you guys see Minority Report?
Yeah.
I did.
Okay. Yeah. Eyeball ads.
There's one specific thing that I'm thinking of that is sort of tangentially advertising it that comes out of the Firefly movie.
Okay, Firefly?
Serenity. You don't see a lot of it in the show because you don't spend a lot of time in the inner world. But if you haven't seen the movie, it's probably a spoiler. If you haven't seen the movie, you haven't been paying attention to Firefly, you probably don't care. The advertising jingles, they're ubiquitous. They're even without special technology, the subliminal advertising. You know the thing, it gets in your head and it stays there.
Oh yeah. In fact, I was talking about jingles with my kids just this morning, strangely enough, because
besides that, they threw in the subliminal effect that is the trigger for their for River, for their super secret crazy person weapon.
Right.
They're the ones that made her crazy, but just to be fair. But it's a ubiquitous jingle, so it's a thing they can play anywhere, anytime, and don't have to figure out where she is, because
that makes sense.
It's an advertising jingle. Who'd notice?
Right. In fact, how many of us have advertising jingles stuck in our heads from like ages ago in our past?
Yeah.
Oscar Mayer wieners.
Thank you. I was thinking that one.
Like,
yeah.
The list of ingredients of the Big Mac. Remember that?
Oh my goodness.
I hated that one.
What's interesting, sort of, is that jingles have faded out. Like, there's whole tracks of like the advertising. It's gone out of style because what they've done more and more is license pop music instead of doing original jingles.
Well, that's interesting. I think it's changed, which shouldn't surprise anyone because things change.
No, and it'll be changing back soon, no doubt. Anyway, so
but think about what they've got now, which is these micro jingles, right? So things like Nationwide is on your side, right? Or but like micro jingles, not even like a song, but like
a line from a song.
A line from a song, or
it's a tagline.
How many of you guys remember the Intel sound?
Oh
yes,
right? That one?
Right.
Yes.
It's just a sound, and it's like a split second long, right?
It's a tagline with a tune.
It's a tag tune.
Which is how you makes it easier to remember the tagline, and it's I don't know if it's easier to come up with, but it takes up less time than an actual jingle.
Well, and you know what? For the IBM stuff, it's inside other products, so they weren't able to take much time away from whatever advertising message the other product had. But they wanted something to allow you to subconsciously connect the instances of the IBM chips.
Yeah, that's the tune that is the tagline.
Right?
Yeah.
Actually, it's the Intel chips. IBM made the computers.
Sorry. Yes. Good point. I need to be very fine-tuned with my terminology, clearly. But so anyway, so tag tunes are very big now. And in fact, there was a tag tune that I ran into when I was living in Japan for 7-Eleven that still pops up in my head. And I feel weird singing it on the air, but anyway, whatever. Okay, it goes like this. Seboon, ireboon, ikiboon. And that was it. It just basically means 7-Eleven, a good feeling.
Okay.
I think it sort of encapsulates that micro jingle sort of thing. I think that there was an Ursula K. Le Guin book that had, or story that had advertising in a future dystopian or an alien dystopian sort of environment. I know that there's only one story that I've written. No, two that have advertising. One of them is Mind Locker, which is a future dystopia. And in the future dystopia, everybody has the internet in their heads, and so they have these active overlays for the world. Like, it's basically like augmented reality, the way that we would imagine it now, except that it's in your head, so you can actually see these things.
Yeah.
And so there are advertising things that have weird scents and but
It's
they can,
for the Matrix.
what? The Matrix has advertising as well. This one basically, my main character lived in a slum that was hidden under a layer of advertising. For anybody who looked at it, they would see only the ads, because of the ubiquity of the mental internet.
Wow.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yep.
So maybe I missed it when I had to take the phone call, but have we defined what it means for, like, what encapsulates an advertisement for the purpose of discussion? Is it just
We haven't
is it
actually
commercial?
gone into that. We sort of jumped in at your dystopia spot. But I think it's useful to ask that, because you do see some instances of, for example, people singing and hawking their wares in fantasy towns.
Right. Or like an advertisement, not advertisement, like the sign out in front of the inn that's like the image, that represents the name of the place.
Yeah.
I can do you like one fantasy, not fantasy, but like at least from ancient times better, where I'm going to tell my story about Rome.
Go for it.
Rome was a HBO series. It only lasted 2 seasons. And I watched it on DVD, and I'm incredibly glad I did to this day, because it had this mode where it was like pop-up video and trivia about Rome that had to do with the scene you were watching would pop up on screen, and you could read more about it.
Okay.
And one of the things was they had the guy out in like the forum / town square who would shout out the news of what's going on, and passersby could stop and listen. And it said that, and he would intersperse these with advertising for a bakery. And apparently in ancient Rome, you could pay the guy who stood in the forum shouting the news to spend however long talking about your bakery and its Roman bread made with Roman wheat. Which was, maybe, total BS or not, because at that point they were importing everything. But so it's
what's Roman? Anything the Romans have taken over?
I think it was, I don't know, but it was supposed to specifically be Roman bread made with Roman grain, because it was, to thwart the imports. It's, like I said, and there was you could say whatever it is. So there's the dual thing of advertising itself and then truth in advertising, which is almost, but not completely separate issue topic that would take a long time to dissect as well. But so it's there is that sort of there's, if you're gonna have a book about commerce, or at least commerce is gonna figure heavily into it,
yeah,
you might want to consider, how do you get the word out?
Mm-hmm.
And hey, town crier, slip him a few coins and he hawks your stuff to the entire town.
Right. Well, and so, the idea behind advertising, of course, is you would like people to know about the thing that you make that they might find useful, and ostensibly people who have an interest in using that thing to know about it, right? And so how do you get that information out? It's the problem of self-marketing on the internet today, right? How do I get the word out about my fill in the blank? Because I know there are going to be people out there who are going to be interested in it. I'm just not sure who they are. And in fact, that is the problem, right? You just don't know who are going to be interested in it.
But here's a question. So advertising is meant to do these things, to get the word out to people who might want your product.
Right.
But if it works, you get more business. And if you are manufacturing something or crafting something, then you have more work to do, which is good up to a point.
Yeah.
But if you have too much work to do, then you have to make a decision. Do you hire someone and train someone, or do you turn away work?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's going to be part of that. That's going to go into, what do I use for an economic system?
Right.
What is the need? What is the need for advertising? Or is it just, hey, Kaya gives the best prices in town, and she smiles while she's doing it. So
Right.
go over to Kaya's shop because she's nicer than the guy down the street who charges 2 pence more.
Right.
And how far?
Yeah, I
I think actually, yeah. So in some ways, what we get is this sort of bifurcation of really, really basic, just sort of town crier, a sign on the front of my shop kinds of things on the one side, and then you've got this sort of dystopian pervasiveness of advertising. And I think the dystopian pervasiveness of advertising is a response to the way that advertising is so pervasive right now in our society. But I don't see that in between.
It's the fact that sort of as an industry, you can advertise as much as you can, as much as you want, almost, like budget permitting. And the question is reach, and they're constantly trying to find new and better ways to reach consumers. And I think for me, what like the insidiousness of advertising comes from it is advertising at its base is manipulation. You're selling not just an item, you're selling a story, you're selling a lifestyle, you're selling a feeling.
Mm.
And the fact is that most people aren't like oh, there's a word for it. Like image literate enough and advertising literate enough to dissect the manipulation. And children are especially vulnerable, which is why in some places it is illegal to advertise to children. Like you can't do any ads aimed at children because right. So but obviously in America that's not true. So you have like children are especially vulnerable to advertise, and like that sort of image literacy is not taught. Like you're not, the ad with like the beautiful woman standing by the car. That's selling the idea that, and I mean, those are like, that's the most obvious one is like, oh, get this car and the girl comes with it, right? Or eventually. So it's like there's a lot of awareness needed to navigate advertising that we don't always necessarily have. And then of course, even those who are, we still buy into it.
Well, okay, so there are a couple things going on here. I like what you're saying. I wanna just take a step back and break it down a little bit. Now I'm just writing down something. Okay, so you've got a couple things going on. One is you have an actual need for something, right? Mm-hmm. Like food, right? Yeah. Then you have this sort of cultural significance of things. And this is where you get these complicated narratives like you are a better person if you have more of X. Mm-hmm. Right. Creation of needs, creation of competition, for example. I need this thing that the Joneses have, right? Because
that's where we're getting into the manipulation, right?
Right. And so Chay's saying at its base, it's manipulation. I think at its base, it's somebody has a need, somebody has a thing. How do we match them up? Okay. But I think very soon thereafter comes the idea that, ooh, maybe I can convince somebody they need something that they don't actually need. I mean, we all kind of like shiny things, right? And so advertising takes advantage of our desire to have shiny things. But the manipulation aspect of it is definitely real. I
mean, they study psychology,
storytelling. Honestly,
ads are stories.
Yeah,
advertisements are tiny stories often, or at least some of the more effective ones are these tiny stories
like
that encapsulate.
Will be a healthy person having this form of life.
Yeah, I mean, watch any cereal commercials. I think are especially good about that because they tell very succinctly these tiny stories of what is great about this breakfast cereal. And no, it's true because the breakfast cereal industry is
totally agree. It's just funny.
Yeah, it's totally. But so.
So, as a parent, I'm especially concerned with advertising that targets children.
Absolutely.
And my children are very young, and I've explained to the kindergarten age kids that they like to watch videos that are basically extended infomercials for kids, where they have adults and kids opening a package of a toy and playing with the toy and being all excited. And they like watching them. And I've said to them, "That's just an advertisement." And I've said to them, they are paying this woman to pretend she is enjoying this toy. And so I have been very explicit about that. And so they know, they like watching them anyway. They're like, I'll periodically look at them and I'll say, that's an advertisement you're watching, because they're on like kids YouTube or something on an iPad. And they'll say, "I know." I'm like, "Okay, just so you know." And you know, so I've engaged them in the process of discerning advertisement from story, right? So they also watch like Steven Universe or whatever.
From art.
Yeah.
And as art.
Right, but the advertisements they watch are they're insidious, because they look just like some enthusiast has made a video.
Right.
And so I tell them when money is changing hands, because they also watch these videos that are kind of cute. They're like, there's some people in various places in the country who dress up in like Anna and Elsa costumes and things like that, and superheroes, and they have adventures around the house, like home movies, and then they post them on YouTube, and the kids like watching those because they're silly. So you've
got this kind of viral marketing. Okay.
Yeah.
Is a really interesting thing because it's hard to do, and it's usually when you get this really sort of this Venn diagram convergence between the advertising message and just the spontaneous enjoyment of a thing, right? Like Chewbacca Mom, where she just got this thing and she was so freaking delighted, right?
Right.
That everybody wanted to see how delighted she was with this thing.
But that wasn't an advertisement.
It wasn't an advertisement.
She later got stuff from them.
Of huge benefit to the company.
Yeah.
Which then decided in retrospect to give her benefits because she was helping them.
Sure.
So it's sort of like backwards advertising, right?
There's definitely a blur. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's more of a product endorsement, right? So there's a difference between an actual endorsement, which this was, right? And which later morphed into a celebrity endorsement because she became a celebrity from the endorsement itself.
Yeah.
But it's a product endorsement, which is a genuine, somebody likes something.
Yeah.
So there's a question. Let's bring this kind of to writing, but not really world building. Like Amazon reviews.
Oh yeah.
Books and things, movies. Some of them are endorsements. Some of them are paid, right? And they try to root that out. They're paid advertisements, essentially, right? Masquerading as endorsements, like those videos that my kids like to watch, masquerading as endorsements from delighted people.
Yeah.
Right? Like I have to explain to my kids that there's no reason why an adult woman would really be that excited about a My Little Pony playset.
Okay, well, the right woman, maybe, but not this particular
you should
woman.
see the level of enthusiasm in these videos.
Wow, I believe that. I believe that.
Yeah.
The reasons for enthusiasm for the set were probably different from the reason that a child would be enthusiastic about it. Level of the child's enthusiasm will inform the level of the enthusiasm of the parent.
Okay, so I'm going to bring in a little concept that I learned when I was studying language acquisition, because I think we're getting at something really interesting here, and that is the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. You guys heard this?
That's key between endorsement.
Yeah, it's a really key difference. And in fact, it makes an enormous difference for whether people are going to be successful at language learning. Because if their motivation for language learning is intrinsic, meaning that they really just want to learn the language, they're going to be far more successful than if their motivation to learn the language is extrinsic. And, well, my mom is paying me to get a good grade in this class, or I've been told I have to get a good grade because it's my obligation to get good grades in school, and I happen to be in this class, kind of stuff, right? And so one of the things that I think we're trying to capture here with our discussion of endorsements versus things that are masquerading as endorsements is this difference between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, right?
Which is how I explained it to the kids, right? To my twins, that she's getting paid. They're paying her money to pretend she likes it. And that was
exactly.
Just her motivation.
That's an extrinsic motivation, right? But yeah, so I mean, I think it's really interesting. The other thing that I think goes on is that's really interesting to look at, and also very hard to articulate with, and probably hard to articulate with in a hangout, is language use, and the way that language is used in advertising, and one could do an entire hangout just on that alone, but it's something that you have to be careful to observe. Persuasive language, and the way that ads will try to sneak in, this is equal to that on the conceptual level by juxtaposing certain kinds of things in language, etc. Yeah, and in fact, I want to get onto that. So I'm responding to something in the chat bar here. What's appropriate to advertise to whom, first of all? And well, so this is a big question. So what is appropriate? For whom? And when?
And also who benefits. For example, we were discussing in the sidebar advertisements for war bonds, right? So that's not a product endorsement. That's a national defense funding issue, which is a different thing.
Well, I mean, we could talk for hours about what people consider worthy projects, right? And why.
You know, this is going to go just a little off topic, but I just want to mention it for people that there's going to be different system of advertising if you're in like a capitalist society or not. Because the state in like communist Russia or whatever, they were the advertisers. They were the ones selling you the thing, and they were like the only ones selling you the thing, but they still advertise.
Yeah.
So there's overlap between propaganda and advertising.
Right? Oh, huge.
Like one shades into the other.
Completely. They are. It's sort of almost one and the same. Advertising itself, of course, is just a business. You have advertising.
One place where you can see the overlap of propaganda and advertising is things like how we advertise products for your July the 4th barbecue. Right? You know, one of the things that I find so fascinating is that you can zero in on a really tiny context, and you can still find all the footprints of these various phenomena in this tiny little instance. Like, here's how I'm going to advertise, you know, hot dogs for your July 4th barbecue. And by the way, I'm going to make sure that I make you feel like if you buy these hot dogs, you are the best American that could ever be. And don't you want to feel like that? Right? So it's, you know, it mixes up because so words have this interesting thing they do, which is that they bring in the contexts in which you've heard them. And so a lot of advertising is actually trying to evoke particular contexts in your mind when you hear it. And those contexts, they want them often to be pleasant, but that's not always what they want. You know, there are some kinds of advertisements that want you to fear a particular thing, and therefore feel that you must rush out and buy the latest firearm or home security system because they are going to just fill you with fear. So it's not always a good feeling and a happy context that's being invoked, but contexts are things like fear of others, fear of invasion, right? Or on the other side of it, childhood, patriotism. There are all kinds of things that are being invoked by the choice of words and the choice of imagery and all that kind of stuff.
And also music, like you take a song that's popular that has happy associations, rewrite the lyrics or whatever, right? Like that advertisement where it was, the original was, I'm gonna wash that man right out of my hair, and they changed it to gray and did it for like a shampoo.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Absolutely. So okay, so now we're getting to someplace interesting. This is where I start getting excited. Because so when we talk about these narratives that advertising brings up, this is where things get really interesting for world building, because in our world, what we see is, like, have you guys ever watched those shows that show all of the international ads?
Yes. Yeah, like the Clios and stuff, yes.
Generally speaking, my impression of international ads is like, whoa, that's so weird, right? But it's so freaking informative, because you're suddenly given access to the narratives surrounding desirability and various kinds of ideals in another culture, right? So this is why advertising in a science fictional world or in a fantasy world would be so incredibly informative about the world, right? Because it gives you a very low-key way to convey some really important things about how people think and what they desire and what they find ideal, right?
Yeah, advertising was a huge part of the background in the new Blade Runner film. Right?
Yeah, well, I imagine so, given that it was so important in the first Blade Runner film.
Right.
Yeah.
But you could tell that it had progressed, right? And a lot of science fiction, we're already in the age of personal targeted ads.
Right.
And you get something like in, say, the movie version of Minority Report, where it reads your eye and then targets the ads to you as you're walking down the street, right? So.
Well, that is like, because there is sort of a confluence between technology and advertising. And so, like, what will that be in the future? What, is a good question. Like,
Well, I think there's something that it keeps coming back to my head every time we talk about like the dystopian futures with advertisement, and it seems it's the question of responsibility, because we also touched on it with the advertising to kids. It seems like with the dystopian future, it's what we're seeing is advertisement without any kind of moral or responsibility, placed around it. So you get these super high, tech targeted, manipulation, to get you to do this thing, that it's like penetrating your personal private life in order to find the most key way to manipulate you into going and getting this product, or maybe,
Yeah, so that's interesting. Because I think it's responsibility to what, really, right? Who is your responsibility to? I think, in fact, when you have this sort of proliferation of advertising, it suggests that you are responsible for keeping the society running by spending lots of money. It's sort of a capitalist, dehumanizing sort of responsibility, right? But there is a kind of responsibility there. It's just not to other people, per se, or to
Well, yeah, so the responsibility
a
is
greater society.
to running ice makers to like Eskimos or something like that. You know, they obviously don't need it, but as an advertiser, if that's what I'm trying to, if that's the goal I'm trying to do, it's not in the interest of the people I'm trying to sell it to. It's in the interest of the person that made the ice maker.
Right.
Yeah, it's advertising is beholden to shareholders. And this is still, again, this is in a capitalist society. So there have been instances where like the government has had to step in and regulate advertising because that so much of the advertising before it was regulated was just flat out lies.
Yeah.
So what we do have is a sort of nominally regulated industry
Right.
of advertising.
But I mean, so for example, there was a really interesting change in advertising in the United States when they started allowing medicines to be advertised.
Ugh.
And it's really a bad idea.
And lawyers.
Yeah.
Lawyers started advertising.
Yeah.
But it's still the case that you can't actually drink beer in a beer ad in the United States. You hold it up and you look at it and you smile, and that's as much as you're allowed to do.
There was a joke about that in an ad once. I remember it.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to drink this.
Yes, exactly.
And
You're not allowed.
Get away.
Just hold it up and look at it.
What was that? What was that ad? Do you guys remember that?
I don't know. Cigarettes, they lost the right to advertise on television, right?
Yeah.
And I remember the court case where Camel had to retire Joe Camel.
Yeah.
Because it was found to be targeting children.
Yeah.
They weren't allowed to use him anymore.
Yeah.
There's also sort of a what and where you advertise, because when the cigarettes sort of lost their hold to advertise in America, they moved to like Asia.
Well, yeah.
Where they can advertise to anyone.
Well, there were other changes with it. Like when I was in college, as a freshman in college, there was a cigarette machine in the lobby of my dorm.
Yeah.
Which, you know, obviously by its nature doesn't check to see if you're 18 or over.
Yeah.
Put money in it and get cigarettes. And that was part of, so in this case, the change in the rules for cigarette sales, distribution, and advertising indicated a shift in the culture, right? And so that's a real thing if you're world building. Like, is everyone smoking or is no one smoking, right? Like, again, you go back to Blade Runner, there were characters that were smoking in Blade Runner because it was noir, not for any real reason other than it was a visual thing, right?
Yeah.
You know, and if you're a replicant, if you're a Nexus 6, you might as well smoke. You only got 4 years to develop lung cancer. It's probably not going to you know, but and then for another example is in the Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber, Corwin, the narrator for the first 5 books, smokes, but he's an immortal amberite, so his lungs regenerate. It doesn't really matter, right? But everyone in 1970s America, when he was writing, Zelazny was writing the novels, were smoking. So that's very much reflected.
Yeah.
In this character, right? But again, so advertising is a window into that, right?
Yeah.
Like you think about the Hunger Games trilogy, the fact that the previous winners were used in advertisements.
Yeah.
Right? They were doing product endorsements that the President Snow wanted them to endorse.
Yeah.
Like his buddies in manufacturing.
Like they had to get sponsors too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hunger Games
that's
is
kind
actually
of an
a really
advertising
good thing to
thing.
bring up.
The games were used to advertise all sorts of products, and the
like
survivors
the
were used to.
right?
Yeah.
You like that's prime advertising.
Yeah.
Because everyone's watching it. It's like Super Bowl ads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another phenomenon, interesting phenomenon, right? The whole Super Bowl ads thing. the fact that there are people who watch the Super Bowl for the ads, who don't care about football.
Yeah, Super Bowl
Don't watch
ads.
the game
Yeah,
at all.
You know,
that is its own thing, isn't it?
yeah.
Yep,
But it's very real. Like the famous, Apple Macintosh 1984 Super Bowl ad that was aired exactly once in the history of advertising, right?
Yeah.
And that had a huge impact, in part because it was only aired once,
Yeah.
right?
Well, so can I take us on a little bit of a left turn here?
At Albuquerque?
Talk about what kinds of things, because we're talking about a window into culture, and so I want to get a little more specific about what kinds of things we learn from that window into culture. Because
I also like to point out that it's also a driver for culture. The advertiser's goal is to wag the dog.
Okay.
As much as reflect what the people want, right?
Yeah. Okay. But that is a sort of a cyclical, I mean, there's a sort of a dialectic thing going on constantly between language use and language change, and advertising taking advantage of culture and recreating culture. I mean, that's one of the features of language and culture. Okay. It's a feature not just of advertising, which I think is, you're not wrong at all. You're absolutely right. But I think it is worth pointing out that it's not just an advertising thing.
Sure.
Because in fact, it's every time we speak, we are recreating the language system and also changing the language system, for example. But I wanted to tell you about this ad, okay, for bread. Now, when we imagine an ad for bread, we're going to imagine something because of the context, the cultural context in which we grew up and the way that we imagine good bread, right? And Cliff's going to imagine good bread a little differently because there are certain types of bread he can't eat, right? But so there was this advertisement that I saw in Japan for bread, and the bread was perfectly square, about that big. It was about an inch thick slice. It was perfectly browned on every outside edge, and the inside of it was this white fluffy thing. If you compressed it, it would have just gone shoop and become like an eighth of an inch thick. It was all air. And the way that the advertisement advertised this bread was it showed you a beautiful shot of the piece of bread sitting by itself on a plate. And then a pair of fingers came in from the corner of the shot and gently squeezed the corner of the bread, and it sprung back. And that was going to show you that you really wanted to buy and eat this bread. And I was like, wow, I can totally skip that forever. I do not want a piece of bread that looks like a white sponge with slightly browned edges, right? But it was so interesting.
Reminds me of the Wonder Bread ads.
Taught me about the way that people conceptualize bread, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, like I remember the ads for Thomas's English Muffins, which were historical dramas about the company founder leaving England and the heartbroken people in England as the company founder moved to America. Right? I mean, there were costume dramas. Thomas is leaving England. What? Oh no! It was they were selling Englishness in their English muffins. Never mind that in most areas of life, people know that English food has this reputation of not being the best food, unless they're doing curries or something.
Curries. Don't even get me started, okay? Because cultural appropriation is a whole other thing that often, super often happens in advertising.
Well, let's talk about that, because
Oh,
if you're
yeah.
world building, you can learn about who are the oppressed people or the colonized people or
Yep.
whatever, and how they're viewed by slipping in an ad or two, right?
Yep.
That
You know,
is true.
and I remember those everyone remembers the crying Indian ad from, if you're of a certain age,
Oh yes.
for the
Oh
pollution,
my God.
right, in the 1970s. And
Yes.
that said a lot about what we thought about Native Americans in our culture at that time, you know.
Yeah.
And authenticity, and, you know, and tying that into, and a very overt attempt to tie that into an environmentalist no littering message, you know. So, and it was a very successful campaign. It was a really successful campaign. That was an exceptionally well aimed, targeted ad.
Yeah.
You know. And then there's another ad that the slogan is still used. Two ads that are local, that are slogans everyone knows. One is "Don't Mess with Texas," which was an anti-litter ad in Texas, but it played to the Texas self-image of independence and strength, right? And even what my folklore professor in Austin called the Texas myth of bigness, right? You don't mess with Texas, because Texas is big and strong. And then the "I Love New York" ads, which were tourism ads for upstate New York, targeted mostly at the New Yorkers in the city, and then also tourist ads for the city, targeted towards people who were not in New York. But it was both. It was advertising the upstate and the city. And you can still get like "I Heart NY" T-shirts that were part of the advertising.
I Heart everything. It sort of expanded into became a meme.
It started with the "I Love New York."
Yeah, I want to go back to the crying Indian ad.
Yeah.
Because that. Because in order to make it clear that they were talking about a Native American, you know, they did the whole costume thing. There's no question that was a costume, but
and
it also others others. But that's But the point is that it others.
Yes.
The Native Americans. It says this person. This is a symbol of a time long ago when, you know, things weren't covered with, you know, disposed of, you know, coffee cups or gum wrappers or whatever. It doesn't say there are people there are Native Americans who are alive today who dress like you and who may or may not litter like you, or it erases the idea that there are living, breathing Americans.
Who might even be watching the advertisement.
Right.
So it is a misuse of the garb.
Yeah.
And an othering of the culture.
Absolutely.
It's a misuse of everything. Just
everything. I think they were sincere when they hired the actor. They thought he was Native, because that's how he portrayed
really?
On his resume. Okay. Yeah, there's whole articles about it. He was Italian.
Okay.
But
so I'm gonna
self-styled as a
I'm gonna pick up this idea of advertising showing who's oppressed and who's not oppressed, because when we are looking at an ad that uses cultural appropriation and mischaracterizes a group of people and all this, it not only are we given that image and that piece of narrative, but that piece of narrative is intended for a particular group. And so we can also get insight into who is being advertised to and whose narrative is being considered the norm, right? Who is the default narrative? Who owns the default narrative? That can also be shown in advertising.
Well, and I think, okay, remember the it was laundry detergent, and it was like ancient Chinese secret.
Oh God.
Remember that? Yeah. I mean, so like, yeah, there is like this whole like sort of I think like you said, it's a good window on that because it's like because that's the thing that you can mock, that it's okay.
Yep.
It's okay to have this funny ad about laundry detergent that's an ancient Chinese secret. And they even said, they said it funny, ancient Chinese secret. So
Yeah, because you got to make fun of everything.
right, yeah. So you do have this about like who's fine to make fun of.
Yeah. No, it's a good point.
In advertising, and then you go to other countries and they're making fun of other ethnic or racial groups. Also, so it's
different groups, right?
Yeah. They're. I don't know if everybody saw that really controversial Chinese laundry.
Oh, that was awful.
Yeah. So yeah.
So, but what's interesting about that is, in that case, they're not targeting different people, but they're targeting the same people, but in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, you can take that. Okay, so that was a really horrible racist Chinese ad where a black guy got stuck in a washer and came out a Chinese guy. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, it was bad.
It was
but you can. It has a clear visual link to the recent Dove ad that caused such an uproar, where a black woman wearing a brown shirt took the shirt off and was a white woman wearing a pink shirt underneath. Right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, they had her take the pink shirt off, and then she was wearing a different colored shirt, and she was an Asian woman or something. But you cannot remove that imagery from the larger context of racist advertising, right? So, yeah, I mean, those things are super revelatory. And if you're using advertising in a fictional world, you can go to town. Honestly, you can be very, it doesn't just have to be, I have the best bread in Rome. It can, it can be as revealing as you want it to be about the social strife that surrounds this society that you're working with.
Sure, well, even that was like, this was in contrast to that barbarian bread that you might get at a discount, right?
Well, true.
Yeah.
You want to buy real Roman bread, not foreigners' bread.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, it's certainly you can create dystopias very easily through advertising. That's been ever since the Space Merchants. That's been a thing, right? Paul and Kornbluth. So, and if you're
put that in chat.
And if you're like writing secondary world fantasy, people tend to scale advertising based on what it was like in medieval Europe.
Yeah.
Imagine it was like in medieval Europe.
Yeah, that's dumb, because if you're doing, I sort of write, I like sort of early 1800s-y fantasy, so that there's like tech and magic, but I don't like the medieval. I still default to Europe, but that's on me, because I just love Britain. But
it's also the only place to get good Roman bread. But anyway.
but there were there was advertising in the 1800s. People had handbills and posters and newspapers. So it would be, it was certainly like a lower, like it wasn't like the high tech advertising of like, beaming ads into your head.
Right. But I think in fact it's worth thinking about as something that happens in your world. I mean, I haven't done a whole lot with advertising in my farm world, but I know that it exists. I just know that among the top castes, it's less intrusive because they don't like it very much, but they have this, you know, they have this way that it's more like people court the nobles for patronage, and then that patronage ends up expanding their reach within the noble caste and that kind of stuff. So I do actually have an idea of how this works, but I haven't had a chance to look at, well, okay, how pervasive is advertising in the general population? So that'll be something for me to work on as I go forward. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So we are at the end of our hour, and thank you all for being here. And let me see if I have information right in front of me about what we're going to do. We should all help
spread the word by advertising Dive into World Building.
There we go. I always end up by talking about what we're going to do next time. Actually, I'm going to have Rebecca Quang on December 12th. But that's not next week. So,
next week is right next to Thanksgiving.
Yeah, next week is the day before Thanksgiving. Are you guys all interested in doing it on that day?
Sure.
I'm gonna be away.
You're gonna be away?
Doesn't mean you shouldn't.
Yeah, I've got nothing going on.
Okay, well, let's talk about birthdays next week.
Okay.
Or coming of age stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
If you want, I mean,
I have lots of I have lots of different topics on my list now that people have suggested. But so we'll do birthdays next week, the day before Thanksgiving. I will be here. Anybody who is available for an hour on that day is welcome. And we'll get this figured out. Okay. Cool. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the broadcast.